It began with a photograph. Simon found it in the attic while clearing out his late aunt's belongings, a forgotten black and white snapshot tucked between the pages of a dusty album. A woman stood in a garden, her face half turned away from the camera. Her dress, stark white against the shadows of the trees, seemed to shimmer as though caught mid-breath. He couldn't look away. Something about her, the angle of her head, the delicate way her fingers brushed the fabric of her skirt, stirred a memory he couldn't quite grasp. The name scrawled on the back in faded ink didn't help. Eleanor. Simon brought the photo downstairs, propping it on the mantelpiece. The house was empty now, silent except for the occasional groan of the floorboards. He had spent the week alone, sorting through his aunt's things, and the isolation had begun to weigh on him. The photo became a kind of company. Each evening, he found himself staring at it, the woman's faint smile drawing him in like a whispered secret. The first night she appeared, Simon convinced himself it was a dream. He woke to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. Bleary-eyed, he shuffled to the door, expecting to find nothing. But there she was, standing at the top of the stairs. Her dress glowed faintly in the moonlight, and her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders. She looked just as she did in the photograph. "Eleanor?" he whispered, though he didn't know why. She didn't answer. She turned slowly, descending the stairs with a grace that seemed almost inhuman. Simon followed, his heartbeat loud in his ears. By the time he reached the parlor, she was gone. Only the photograph remained, its edges curling slightly as if it had been handled. Simon's aunt had been a private woman, her life shrouded in quiet mystery. The neighbors described her as kind but distant, a widow who rarely left her house. When Simon tried to ask about Eleanor, they grew evasive. One old man, leaning heavily on his cane, muttered something about the cursed Harrington girl before shuffling away. The attic offered no answers. The photograph was the only trace of Eleanor Simon could find, and yet she seemed to be everywhere. He saw her in the mirror when he passed too quickly, a fleeting blur of white. He felt her presence in the empty rooms, the air growing colder as though she'd just left. At night he heard her footsteps pacing above him, a restless rhythm that seeped into his dreams. One evening, the air felt thick with something unspoken. The shadows in the parlor stretched long, the faint hum of a storm approaching rattling the windows. Simon, unable to shake the unease, stood before the photograph, studying Eleanor's smile. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice a mere whisper. The question felt more like an accusation. The answer came in fragments. A letter, tucked beneath a floorboard in his aunt's bedroom, written in a hand trembling with age. "Eleanor will not forgive me. I should have burned the dress. The mirror holds too much." Simon read the note over and over, trying to make sense of it. The mirror? The only mirror he had seen in the house was in the attic, an old cracked thing leaning against the far wall. He hadn't paid it much attention before, but now it felt significant, as if it had been waiting for him. The attic was colder than he remembered. The mirror stood in the same spot, its glass warped with age. When Simon approached, his reflection shimmered like heat rising off pavement. For a moment he thought he saw her there, standing just behind him, her eyes dark with sorrow. "Eleanor," he whispered again. This time, the mirror seemed to respond. The glass rippled, and a sound like a sigh filled the room. Eleanor's story unraveled slowly, in pieces Simon barely understood. She had loved someone once, a man whose name was lost to time. His aunt's letters hinted at a tragedy, a betrayal that had left Eleanor heartbroken. The dress had been her wedding gown, and the mirror had been her prison. Simon didn't know what he believed. The rational part of him insisted he was imagining things, that grief and isolation were playing tricks on his mind. But then there were the dreams. Vivid, haunting dreams where he stood in the garden from the photograph, Eleanor's hand cold in his. She spoke to him, but her words were muffled, as though coming from underwater. He woke each time with a sense of loss so profound it felt like drowning. The house's decay seemed to accelerate. Cracks spread across the walls, and the once warm wood floors grew splintered and gray. Simon's own reflection in the mirror began to change. It lingered a moment too long after he moved, its eyes darker, its smile twisted. The photograph on the mantelpiece fell one morning, the glass shattering. He didn't pick it up. Eleanor appeared more often now, Always silent, always just out of reach. Her dress was no longer pristine. Streaks of shadow clung to the fabric, and her face seemed to grow fainter each time he saw her. "What do you want from me?" Simon demanded one night, his voice cracking. The mirror answered, not with words, but with an image. The garden again, its trees bare and skeletal. And there, beneath their boughs, a stone marker overgrown with moss. Simon knew without being told that Eleanor's name was carved there. He found the garden the next day, hidden behind a thicket of brambles at the edge of the property. The gravestone was just as he'd seen it, the name Eleanor Harrington barely legible beneath the dirt. He knelt, brushing away the debris with trembling hands. As he worked, he felt the air shift, growing colder, heavier. He didn't need to look up to know she was there. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he wasn't sure for what. "I don't know how to help you." The wind answered, carrying a single word: burn. Simon's hands shook as he carried the mirror into the yard. He doused it in kerosene, the liquid pooling around its ornate frame. Eleanor watched from the edge of the garden, her figure barely visible in the twilight. "This is what you want?" he asked, his voice cracking. She didn't move, but the air seemed to hum with approval. The flames leapt high, consuming the mirror with a ferocity that startled him. The glass shattered, releasing a sound like a scream. For a moment, he thought he saw Eleanor's face in the fire, her eyes meeting his with something like gratitude. Then she was gone. The house was quiet after that. The cracks in the walls remained, but the oppressive weight that had filled the air lifted. Simon stayed long enough to finish clearing his aunt's belongings, then left, locking the door behind him. He never returned. But sometimes in his dreams, he saw her, not in the house, not in the mirror, but in the garden, her white dress clean and her face finally at peace, as though she had been waiting for him to let her go.